Well, Steve, welcome to the show.
Casey, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
As I mentioned in the introduction, you've written a book called Confessions, and I got a chance to read the book. Excellent book. And for those of you who are listening, however you're listening, it's really, I would say, just a refreshing and honest look at pastoral ministry. I think that's kind of how I would kind of categorize the entire process. We have a lot of things in common, which I was interested as I was reading the book, was kind of interesting to go through. But what was your reason for writing the book to begin with?
You know, Casey, it's interesting with the connection about pastors. And the funny thing is, I really did not even write this for people in full-time ministry. But what I have found out over the past year in discussions with a lot of pastors, that they responded by thinking, wow, I get it. I've been there and things of that nature. But in essence, I really wrote it and primarily for young men who are maybe questioning the goodness of God and throwing out questions out there that maybe they're not going to ask a pastor. They're not going to publicize, they're going to put on the strong face. But there are a lot of issues in the book that are common to all mankind, and a lot of it particular to men in general, and then even more specifically, men who grew up with a godly father in the house, which is my story. So a lot of the thought, Casey, was taking my narrative and then taking these pieces of life, whether it's sexuality or whether it's trust or whether it's even ministry, and then using that as a backdrop to touch on these questions. There is an element of it. Matter of fact, a fun chapter in the book is simply titled, "I Hate Being a Nice Pastor." And that does address a lot of the questions or misconceptions that people have about ministry today, and what are the expectations of those folks who wear the multiple hats we call pastor.
Excellent. I thought it was kind of interesting because you're in one of those rare groups of church planter, and not just a rare group because there are church planters and then there are church planters. And the group that I'm describing are, to start with, they're completely out of their minds to even do that.
Bad dogs.
I can really relate to that because there's a difference between being a church planter when you really start from scratch.
Right.
And there's a difference between being a church planter, like, for example, here I'm living in Connecticut, we're the land of the frozen chosen, but you don't see a lot of mega churches in Connecticut. There's probably 2, maybe 3. Mm. And typically the way that they plant, and there's certainly nothing wrong with this, is they grab 100 people and they start something. They open with a budget $500,000 and away they go. Right. And God bless them for being able to do that. Not trying to cast shade on what they're doing necessarily, but in some ways I have to feel that there's something lost without that struggle that does come from church planting, and you could really hear that in your book. That sense of, it's just you and God, and if he doesn't show up, you're cooked. And Casey, as strange as it sounds, I've done it a few times. I'm 65 years old. I've planted a few churches, large, small, and medium. And I'll tell you what, if God said, leave the church that I'm currently pastoring, I've been pastoring for a number of years, but if he said, tomorrow I'll start another one, I would jump at the chance. Mm. And that makes me really sick. There's just very few people who would do that, but I would look at that and say, wow, that sounds exciting. So you have been on a church planting journey like that. You talk about in the book about how, as a young man, you kind of started on a journey. I think it lasted 5 years, and a betrayal really kind of sent you in the right direction, but sort of looked like it was going to derail your ministry. Maybe share a little bit about that.
Right, and there, even though there are separate chapters in this book, Finding Hope Through a Pastor's Doubt, there are themes that kind of go through that, and the connection here in the first chapter, I talk about the title of the chapter is When Only God Understands ADHD. And looking at some of the things that God wired into me, this entrepreneurialism or wanting to press the ball down the field and wanting to do more. And that tied into a desire to plant a church. And you're right. In 2004, my wife and I and 4 kids moved to Sacramento, California to start a church from scratch. We had some peripheral people around us, but we did not have a core group or anything like that. And in that process, we did plant a church. It wasn't a mega church. It wasn't a huge church, but we were reaching lost people in the Sacramento area. There was a point in time where I was looking at the future, and a gentleman had made some promises, and he didn't really follow up on those promises. And I'm not diminishing the guy. He did what he thought was right, in his own eyes at the time. Because he feel like I was not entrepreneurial enough. And you're right, that did send me down this spiral of just questioning, who am I? What am I doing? Have I heard God wrong? And is God even good? After all, he's made all these promises and I've stepped out on faith. And where is the realization? But I found out through the process that God was doing something bigger within me, and I'm hoping that lesson will be seen in the book, that if we really want to see the goodness of God, sometimes we have to look beyond the immediate fruit, and we have to look at the bigger picture, sometimes to the picture of eternity, that everything in this realm will not ever happen exactly like we want it to, but yet God is still faithful. So I think, Casey, that's part of my hope, not just for pastors, but for anybody to realize no matter what you're going through, God is still faithful. So just hang on.
Yeah, and I think the dynamic, it's interesting because a couple of podcasts ago, I interviewed Ed Tuttle, who shared with us the book, The Ordinary Life. And one of the premises of that book is just that, we often are trying to celebrate something that's beyond us, and we don't appreciate the ordinariness of God. I don't want to say ordinary in a bad way, but that God has made us the way we are, and that he celebrates us. One of the things that I appreciate about the church planting thing, again, although the pain and the dynamics of that is difficult to really share in a way with somebody who doesn't understand, but something happens in your character when you have been through that church planting experience, as painful as it can be when you're really all alone, but you learn the faithfulness of God in a way that you honestly just don't any other way. And there's something that comes out on the other end of that where I don't need, as a pastor, I don't necessarily need the affirmation of other people to determine for me what God is saying or doing anymore. I needed a lot of that as a young man. I needed that kind of affirmation. And of course, we all want affirmation. I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
Right.
But you don't need that in order to determine whether God is directing you or not anymore. I can know that God is with me whether I feel like it or not. And I think that going through that church planting experience really accomplished that for me.
I like what you said about whether you feel it or not. I mean, that's part of the Christian journey as well, is walking by faith in the sense that you're walking according to what the word says, the promises say, opposed to what we feel. Because there's a whole lot of just really negative feelings that come along with being a church planter, with being a man. And then I think in particular in our modern age, with plethora of everything that is on social media and always checking stats. This woman is getting this and I'm doing this. This man's doing this and I'm doing this. And the world seems to be celebrating that, but not celebrating this. And then being able to take a step back and say, well, it's okay because I'm trusting in the big picture that God knows what he's doing. And I really hope people will hear what you've just said. You've been through it, and you get that reality that the peace comes from the appreciation of God and not whatever may or may not come from man.
I also have to say I appreciate it, and again relate to the whole dynamic of titles. I did a podcast on it a number of years ago, but there is this sense of, God has given us this, when you're called to full-time church ministry, or quite frankly any ministry, but church ministry in particular, there are those folks that really, they got to have that title in front of their names, but they just don't have an identity. And that's very sad to me. I had a friend of mine years ago, and we played golf a couple of times. I mean, we weren't really close at the time, but we played golf a couple of times. He was studying for the ministry, and one day I met him at a kind of a multi-church event, and I went up to greet him by his first name. Let's just say his name was Bill. I said, "Hey, Bill, how you doing?" And he stopped and said, "Pastor Bill." And I said, "Oh, okay." And and then he stopped and he said, "No." He said, "Pastor Bill." And he made it very clear that I was to call him by the title his mother never called him by. But it became a thing of where, frankly, we never golfed again. But just this dynamic of creating this air of, without a title, you don't have identity. And it's not saying that there isn't respect due, because the scripture is very clear about that. But right. I have found that when we as leaders are really kind of possessed by this identity of a title, we really kind of, in some ways, I have to say, somewhat lose our humanity. It's not that I've been a pastor for more than 40 years. I love that calling, but the title isn't what makes me a pastor. It's the calling that makes me a pastor. And right. What I actually do that makes me a pastor, not whether I have a title. And I appreciated your book bringing that out quite a bit.
I would affirm that and agree with that. And I've had some of the same situations of guys who want that title. But I think part of the angst for me is the misunderstanding as to what exactly that means. Because part of my struggle, and I would apply this to any man, any woman who's struggling for an identity in God's kingdom. But part of my struggle is to identify what that means. For example, you listen to somebody big on the radio like Chuck Swindoll or Andy Stanley or whoever, they wear the title pastor. But they hardly ever, if ever, will go make a hospital call when someone's sick.
Not a verb.
Right. So we have all these different ideas thrown into the one word pastor. And even in Ephesians chapter 3, we find out that there are various roles: prophet, evangelist, teacher. It's not just that one word pastor. But for me in my journey, trying to look at all of these hats and say, you know what? I don't think God's called me to wear every one of these hats. I just need to wear the one that God's, or the two or three or whatever, the ones that God has called me to wear. And then in addition, and that was part of the angle too, that we are human, and that part of the message for the church is this reality check that even though there is this person who is called to be in full-time ministry, there are other things that the average Christian needs to do in their own journey. And sometimes they throw it to the person who wears the title, right, because they're the expert, when in reality, the average follower of Jesus needs to be doing some of these things themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the true job of pastoring, as you know, is, as it says in Ephesians, is to equip the saints
right.
to the work of the ministry. And it, whether we say it or not, we often say it and teach it. But I think when you have that title that is really, when you exalt that title, or when a person exalts that title and makes a big deal about it, they almost at the same time communicate, listen, you don't have to do the work, I'll do it for you.
Right.
And there is that balance. Again, I in no way do I want to, make people denigrate the office or look down on pastors and sort of look at it. There are people that sort of revel in not using a title because they, for whatever reason, they need an identity that way. I'm not in any way suggesting that's a good thing.
Right.
I think as leaders, we need to be real, and that's what I really found refreshing about Confessions. You're not holding anything back. You're just,
it was pretty real.
This is where I've been. This is what happened when I was a kid. This is what happened with my dad. This is what happened, good, bad, and indifferent. And I think that there needs to be just more of that for those of us who serve in ministry. We really need to remember No, we're human beings, and God has called us, but that doesn't change anything about an essence of who we are, other than the calling that He's given us.
Right. And I think part of the hope, again, was to convey this idea. Here I am. I'm a pastor. I'm supposed to have all of the answers. Okay. Well, I don't. Therefore, I can say to anyone, again, especially young men, hey, I have gone through the tunnel and I see the light at the end of the tunnel, and maybe you can as well. So that was part of it. But like we said at the beginning, it's been interesting in this journey, Casey, to see a number of pastors who have read it, who have said, wow, I get it. I've been there. Not everybody gets it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Listen, Steve, how can people get a hold of this book or contact you?
Well, it is available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and then Audible as well. My personal blog site is kingdomology.com, and the front page has a link from there to the Amazon link. I do have a Facebook page, Steve Hinton Author, on Facebook, and then Steve Hinton Author on Twitter. So there are various ways you can do that. Primarily, the blog might be the easiest. But again, the Kindle version, the print can be ordered through Amazon and then Audible as well.
Fantastic. Listen, thank you so much for being a part of Minister's Toolbox today. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Casey, thank you very much, and I really hope that this will be an encouragement to someone.
God bless you.